Welcome to another episode of Closed. I'm Lee Bergstein. Really excited to have with us today John Walkup, who is the co-founder of UrbanDigs Analytics. It's a New York City company turning the city's sprawling rental and sales data into hyper-local real-time market intelligence for real estate professionals. A lot to talk about with John, but today we're just going to talk about the Fair Act and the impact of that act, which some of you may know, some of you may not know. I'm going to let John kind of give a better explanation of it than I could in a second. But first off, John, thanks so much for being here today.
No, it's a pleasure. So thank you just for inviting me. So I'm looking forward to talking about this issue.
I didn't invite you, but someone invited you, so you're here. You're it. So let's, I guess, why don't we start with a little bit about just what UrbanDigs Analytics is, how it's providing value to the real estate industry, and then we can kind of move over to the Fair Act.
Yeah, so UrbanDigs, basically what we do is we take a very granular look at the data. We look at data, really from the unit level up, and we pull in data from all different sources to kind of really give you a 360-degree view of any given unit in the city. And then what we do is we try to, apply the analytics to that. So when you're looking to buy or you're looking to sell or invest, you can kind of, move forward with confidence that you've got the best price, you got the best information that you're working with, and you got also kind of sense of how the market is doing. So we like to look at the market as two points. There's always the market sentiment and there's prices. And sometimes they're doing very, very different things, even though the market appears to be moving in one direction. So it's nice to be able to separate those things out and really kind of view it on a piece by piece level.
All right. So we'll talk about those two components, I guess, through the prism of the Fair Act. And why don't we start, if you're in an elevator with somebody and trying to explain what it was in a minute, what is the Fair Act? How is it impacting the real estate market?
Yeah, I know. Sometimes you get bogged down in the weeds on this, but essentially it means if you're advertising an apartment, then the person who hired you to advertise that apartment is the person who pays the fee. So if you're a broker and you've got an exclusive with the landlord and you're advertising that apartment on behalf of a landlord, the landlord is required to pay your fee. You can't have a tenant then come pay your fee, unless of course you have a representative agreement with the tenant, in which case you're looking on their behalf. But that's a whole other case of worms, and it adds another layer of confusion. But generally speaking, if you advertise, the person who pays you is the person who asked you to advertise.
So that was, I guess, passed pretty recently, right? A few weeks ago. We're sitting here on July 16th. I think it was passed middle of June 11th. So don't have a whole lot of data yet. I know data takes a while to actually be actionable, but based on what you're seeing so far, what are kind of like the immediate impact of the action?
So the interesting thing about the rental market is that it actually moves really, really quickly. I mean, the sales market in New York City moves kind of quickly, but it's a snail's pace compared to the rental market. I mean, when we're looking at data, if something's been on the market in the rental market for longer than 2 weeks, it's stale. This market moves really quickly. So what we like to do is there are various ways of measuring what's coming on, what's going off. We just kind of like to take a look at what's coming over the revenue listing service feed. These are exclusives, exclusively listed by agents on the site. And we get a sense for how many are coming on. And then we just look at the median asking rent for that batch that's coming on. And the idea is that if you're looking for an apartment through an agent, this is what you're going to see. And the first thing we saw was a drop in the number of available rentals coming in through RLS. So these are the units that are being put forward by brokers on behalf of landlords and management companies. That inventory really dropped through the floor, and the price started rising for those fewer units that were coming on. And that was a trend that sort of carried on throughout that month or so that we've seen. And it kind of got to the point where that level of supply became unindicative, if that's a word, of the overall market. So basically our sample size shrank to a point where we're like, all right, we can't really make broader predictions at this point because the inventory coming on is just so low.
Yeah,
it's being shared.
So it makes sense to me why the prices would go up. Obviously, landlords are baking the additional cost into the rent. Why is the inventory dropping though?
So that's the thing, and I'm hoping that if there's one thing that I hope recovers from this, it's not that I'm against the Fair Act. I'm a big fan of transparency, but when listings start disappearing, to me that's non-transparent, and I'm not sure where they're going. So it is a concern that they may be going underground or wherever they're going. But I don't have visibility into it, so I can't speak to it. But the reason they're going off is because suddenly these brokers who were posting these listings through the feed were now being required to be compensated by the landlord, and they couldn't recover it from the tenant. So that was basically a sea change in how business was done. And in order to comply from the law, that knee-jerk reaction is just take it off and we'll put it on later. And here we are a month later, and they haven't really come back on.
It feels like somewhere in I don't know if you followed this, but somewhere in the same bucket as landlords kind of keeping rent stabilized units vacant because they just don't know what to do with them, or they're waiting for a change, or they're waiting for more clarity, which is obviously very bad for the market as well. Less publicly available inventory. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that just feels just really bad overall for the rental.
It is. And so we have a chart that we usually put out. We talk about sometimes with agents and brokers. We call it listing rental dynamics, basically. And one of the things we're looking at is the interplay between supply, which is the units coming on, and demand, which is the listings that are marked rented. Usually what happens is when there's more supply than there is, than like post-COVID, the depths of COVID, we had a lot of supply. We didn't have a lot of renters. What happened? Prices dropped. That started reversing itself, and we very quickly went into a market where there's a lot more demand and a lot less supply. And we started seeing those crazy 30% year over year increases in rent. And those dynamics, they've compressed a little bit, but demand is still exceeding supply. And so now we're at this point where, as I was saying, that listing volume coming in from the RLS has shrunk even more, which is only going to pressure market dynamics. So if there's the one force I think that's out there that's really kind of difficult to put a pin on and really understand it from different angles because it's just opaque, is that market force. And I think the FAIR Act simply just exacerbated that dynamic to the point where, again, we were going to have to step back because that inventory number for us is just too small of a sample size.
What steps can be taken to broaden the sample size, assuming that we suddenly don't see an influx of new listings? Are there other data sources that you can start to look to? Are there other ways to kind of build a more actionable sample size moving forward?
Well, we're sort of at the behest of Rebney because we subscribe to their feed, and we're basically a portal for Rebney in that sense.
Yeah.
Street Easy has obviously by far they're the elephant in the room. They've got the individual feeds coming from land management companies, landlords, all that kind of stuff. Mom and pop, if you just have a multifamily, you want to put something out there, you just go right to Street Easy and you basically bypass the industry. So they have a different look. But they also do data a different way. So they're seeing some similar things, some different things than we are. But again, it's the idea that there's this market force, that there's just more demand than supply right now. Mm-hmm. And what can be done to alleviate that? I mean, the only thing you can really to get those juices flowing, I think that's a bigger ask of government. And I don't know if that's something we necessarily want to get into here.
I mean, I'm trying to think through how does this change? Because the act is not going away anytime soon, right? So the market's going to have to adapt to the act. From what you're hearing, your clients, folks at Rebney, are there conversations going on about how the market can adapt to the act to make sure that landlords and tenants are able to continue to do business in a way that makes sense for them in the city?
Yeah, and there certainly are. So this is a lot of, we're talking about anecdotal evidence here now. Cool. So it was initially met. I mean,
not data. We're taking you out of your safe place and moving to speculative.
I know. It's very speculative. But listen, we talk to dozens of agents every day. So we hear this is, it's an even smaller sample size, but it's somewhat representative of the angst, I think, in the industry. Yeah. So the enactment of this act on June 11th was, it was basically 6 months of hand wringing before we got to that point. And even after this, it's real sort of, white knuckle trying to figure this out. And I think the most angst is on the brokerage companies that typically make their living by representing landlords, because now if they have an exclusive agreement with the landlord and they want to put out a whole bunch of listings, they have to be compensated by the landlord, which is a sea change in business. So I think there are definitely some conversations about, revolving around what the nature of that representation is, how it's going to be compensated, what role the tenant compensation part might play if they have to have some sort of exclusive with tenants in order to do it. I don't think there's been any clear-cut strategies that have really been proven out yet, but I know that there's certainly a lot of conversations happening behind the scenes trying to figure this out.
Is there any other than like the core data that you were looking at, which is how many listings coming on, median asking price, is there any other data that you can pull from that might be a little more encouraging, or that might point towards landlords and brokers are beginning to figure out how to deal with this issue? Is there anything else that you're looking at that might not be as directly on point, but that still points to like some change in the last month trending down?
That's a great question, and I think the answer to that is yes. So I think I'm revealing my very sort of Manhattan bias here. So when we started,
I don't live here anymore. I have a Manhattan bias as well. So
I know, and I just sort of like have this natural inclination that doesn't everybody have a Manhattan bias? But again, look, we started here.
This problem Manhattan bias.
I know, exactly. Yeah, I'm in my bubble. Look, we started here. Most of our clients are here, but we also serve Brooklyn. And one of the things we looked at in Brooklyn was we saw the same sort of things in inventory, right? We saw that inventory decline, and I think that's sort of a legalistic framework trying to understand how can we advertise these listings and still be paid at the same time. Do we have to have tenant representation? Can the landlord pay us? So these kind of were taken off, but the asking rents for the Brooklyn ones didn't increase as much as Manhattan. And I think Manhattan is really in the throes of just a really, really competitive rental market. I mean, it's a tight market, and this sort of just it's adding fuel to that fire. The Brooklyn market is also tight, but it's a much broader market. And so when you look at those rents across the board in Brooklyn, they didn't really move up as high as they moved up in Manhattan, at least according to our data. So to me, that's sort of a step in the right direction, right? Just trying to get that transparency out there, trying to say, listen, I mean, it's clear who's paying who in this relationship. So I think, going forward, I think, all right, hopefully we can smooth out some of these speed bumps, but we're just going to need more supply.
So does that mean that people are already gravitating towards Brooklyn? This is anecdotal. I don't have a data dashboard in front of me. I have a Brooklyn bias as well because I went to law school there, and then I lived there until I was dragged to the suburbs during COVID against my will, kicking and screaming. But obviously, I hear from friends, colleagues, younger people, like there's already a gravitational pull towards Brooklyn. Is this going to increase that pull, and then maybe the result is Manhattan starts to kind of come down to combat the gravitational pull towards Brooklyn? I know we're getting away from data and more towards theory and speculation, but that's kind of what I'm hearing a little bit.
Lee, you're giving voice to my nightmares. Yes, I think so, because I mean, look, when you go through Brooklyn, I
A
mean,
whole podcast called Voice to the Nightmares. So you can come on that one. And we can
right.
talk about your nightmares in more detail.
There we go. Yeah, I think that's probably have to sign some sort of HIPAA to get onto that one. But yeah, no, listen, you go through Brooklyn. I mean, it's an amazing dynamic place. I mean, you could start in Greenpoint, work your way down. I mean, basically, the western half, central half or so of Brooklyn has really undergone, I mean, it's a remarkable change in the last 10 years, even 15 years from what it was to what it is now. And it's the place that people want to be. And, one of the things that we like to talk about dealing with the sales market is we'll have agents come up to us and they'll have a listing that's really not making the headway they thought. And we'll look at it, and maybe it's like Sutton Place or Turtle Bay, or it's somewhere in the Upper East Side. And the idea is that 30 years ago, if you wanted to say you made it in New York, you had a co-op in Sutton Place, you'd go to the Met Opera, you're at Lincoln Center, right? All these things are very Manhattan centric. And now maybe you've got a place in Tribeca, maybe you're in Williamsburg or Cobble Hill, and you go to BAM instead. So there's been a cultural and sort of lifestyle shift that really is pointed more toward Brooklyn than Manhattan. So to your point, yeah, I am a little concerned about that, but I do think there's one of the things that we witnessed post-COVID is we witnessed the recovery in Manhattan start on the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side. Those residential neighborhoods really started going. And, you walk down Second, I mean, I'm an Upper East Side guy, so I got to represent Yorkville. But when I walk down Second Avenue, like it's a fun and energetic, dynamic place. And in the city, the restaurants are outside. Like it's a great place to be. Now, that feeling only exists for about 15, 20 blocks on the Upper East Side, and then you kind of it's in bits and pieces elsewhere, but that vibe just kind of continues through Brooklyn. It's a gravitational pull, and I'm hoping that Brooklyn doesn't necessarily pull from Manhattan, but I'm hoping that rising tide lifts both of our boats up.
Yeah. We didn't put this on our script, so you might not be prepared to talk about it, but obviously there's a mayoral election coming up.
What? I haven't heard about this. This year?
Mayoral election, there's another one.
Right.
Which one was more important? I guess we'll find that out in a few months. But how is your company, and how do you see the broader rental market beginning to prepare for? I won't call it an eventuality, but the likelihood that the next mayor is going to be Zoran Mamdani, and he obviously has certain plans for how he's going to treat at least stabilized rent in the city, and that's certainly going to have an impact on market rent. Has your company started to kind of dig through some of the iterations of how the rental market might be impacted by that, and what are you hearing from brokers?
Yeah, so no, because I don't think we've seen any solid policy proposals. I don't think we've seen who the cabinet's going to be yet. So we're sort of cautiously taking an approach. But if the FAIR Act was met by 6 months of hand wringing before it's happening, this election is hand wringing and teeth gnashing and self-flagellation. I mean, it's the whole kit and caboodle. So you have the entire industry is very, very concerned about someone shaking the tree to change things up. So there's obviously this concern on the revenue side, but I think one of the things that's really not coming across is the possible, and I'm just, this again, this wasn't scripted, so I'm just talking off the cuff here. I think there's sort of an energy and dynamism that, a young, mayor could bring to the city. Whether or not you agree with his policies or not, there could be some sort of, vibe to that brings people into the city, that makes it a place that young people want to move to, which would be good for the city. So I'm trying to kind of, take the bad with the good. I understand a lot of policy proposals. To me, they're not necessarily ones that I think are in the right direction. But that being said, there could be some silver linings to the clouds here.
Yeah, I was reading a New York Times article yesterday, actually, because I guess he's meeting with business owners right now and trying to take down the temperature in the room on that front. And somebody had a quote that said, "Well, his policies are basically De Blasio, but he's just way more pleasant to be around than De Blasio was." And to your point, business leaders didn't flock to leave New York City during De Blasio. They survived that. So if the policies are roughly the same, which they for the most part appear to be, and who knows how many of them are actually going to be enacted, how many will be moderated. But there is that dynamic element. There's that, uh, you know, what made him such an attractive campaigner translates to him as an executive. Maybe you do have more excitement among younger people. Nobody's leaving. And even though some of the policies might not necessarily be what the real estate market wants to see, it could all kind of shake out in the wash if that's what happens. I know maybe I'm just kind of acting as an armchair therapist for our listeners right now, but that was my
Well,
way.
I'm gonna touch wood on that, because I think that's to me that's a fair assessment, and that's what I'm hoping. I think, my biggest concern is, that the budget is loaded up and New York City enters a deep deficit, which is going to be really difficult to recover from. However, again, I don't think we've seen any really concrete policies, what could be watered down, what not. But look, dealing with the real estate industry on a day-to-day basis, I understand the problem of how the housing crisis, the persistent housing crisis that New York City has. I view it as a question of supply, and obviously there are many tentacles that come into it. But
Yeah.
one of the things that we constantly see is, especially in the rental market, is there's a real sort of bifurcation of the market. There's the market lease rents, and then there's the rent control and rent stabilized. And these two markets are doing vastly different things. And it's really that market rate rent that is just getting absolutely whipped around. So when we talk about increases post Fair Act, that's the cohort we're talking about. If you're rent controlled, rent stabilized, you're not necessarily seeing some of these same movements. So the solution that is keep being proposed, which is just, let landlords compete, let them build, let them get supply out, and that would kind of bring things down. I have to say that I'm sympathetic to that argument, but again, this being the city, nothing is that easy or
Well, I
straightforward.
would imagine you're not really the fair act's not impacting rent stabilized units because none are available. They're they're either being held by the tenant or landlords when they become vacant are just sitting on them for the most part. And I guess there's mixed market affordable projects that are in the process of being built, but those are going to be the only real um, heavily coveted stabilized units that are going to come in the market in the near future, particularly if Mamdani is elected and there's a rent freeze that even exacerbates the problem more. I know we're going
Right.
far from what we first started talking about. So let's go back to the
Yeah.
data.
Okay.
You come back on the show a year from now, and I ask you to pull up the Urban Digs data metric dashboard. What do you expect to kind of be the most surprising piece of data, or what are you kind of most excited to see what happens over the course of the next year?
I would love to see more. I would love to see more rental supply coming on. The sales market's got its own issues. I could easily talk about that for another hour. But
Yeah.
if we're just talking about the rental market, I think we just need more supply in both Manhattan and Brooklyn. I would love to be proven wrong. I would love to see some of these rent controlled. I would love to see some rent stabilized units actually being able to get onto the market, get some tenants in. In general, I want New York City to kind of get back to, get its groove back. We saw a net outflow of people during COVID. We've recovered some of that, but I'd like to see people back to work. I'd love to see some of these ground floor businesses taking off, especially in Midtown, and I'd like these apartment buildings to be full of renters coming into work. So that would be a net win-win for the city, and that's what I'd be hoping to see.
I definitely agree with you there. For those in the real estate industry who want to kind of learn more about Urban Digs, see if they can get access to the platform, where do they go? What do they do? Who should they follow? All that good stuff.
Time for my shameless plug. So urbandigs.com is our main portal site.
We cut the podcast off already, so you're just doing this to me.
Oh, okay, great. So this is it. So it's urbandigs.com. And then there's urbandigs.co. So we have a new product called Advisor, and that's for buyers, sellers, investors, in which we do a 360 view. We have an appraiser come in and do a look at that. And so if you want to have a market, what are buyers thinking about any given unit at any given time? That's our premier product. That's at urbandigs.co. Okay.
Well, John, this was great. I always say to our guests who are data driven, we should definitely do this again 6 months or a year just to kind of see how things have changed and evolved and take a look back at whether the predictions or the fears were warranted. So let's definitely put that on the calendar to do. I appreciate your time.
Awesome. I'd love that. Thank you, Lee. Appreciate the time.
For more on all things real estate and the law, subscribe to this and our other podcasts. Follow Bergstein, Flynn, Knowlton, and Polino on social media. Subscribe to our newsletter and go to bfklawoffice.com. That's bfklawoffice.com to learn more.